Hey class, welcome back to Introductory Psychology. We're using the King textbook and we are almost to the halfway point. Well, I guess we are chapter 7, 7 out of 14 chapters. So this, after this chapter, you're halfway done with the course or the textbook. So, maybe pat yourself on the back for that one to know you've made it this far. So chapter 7 is kind of a smattering of topics related to cognitive psychology. So we'll look at the broader topic of cognition, otherwise known as thinking. We'll look at how that relates to intelligence, and then and another related subject under the umbrella of cognition, which is language. So this chapter is kind of broken into 4 parts, initially looking at the cognitive revolution, which sort of gave rise to the development of cognitive psychology, computer science, neuroscience, all of these things now that are quite well established, but obviously at one point we're not. We'll look at kind of, under that umbrella of cognition, under the cognitive revolution, look at thinking, intelligence, and language. And this is one of the shorter chapters, so it'll probably also be one of the shorter videos I record, just heads up. So cognitive revolution, ultimately, when we think about, cognition, the study of cognition is, has, been a part of the human experience, since birth. But more recently, we've seen, roughly since the development of the 1950s and so forth, going forward, we've seen what's known as the cognitive revolution, which is psychology's push to study and understand the modern, science of psychology, trying to understand how we think, how we process information, how do we manipulate information in terms of remembering, like we talked about in chapter 6, thinking, which we'll talk about now, and then knowing, we talked about in chapter 5. So chapter 5, 6, and 7 kind of all fall under that umbrella of cognition. Roughly, we're talking about the 1950s, where the focus in psychology switched from primarily being dominated by behaviorism and psychodynamic theory to now let's open the doors and talk about the mind and mental processes. And ultimately, it really, that parallels the development of computer science. I mean, computers, whether we're talking about like the MacBook I'm recording on right now, a desktop on your, on your computer desk, or the computer you carry around in your pocket every day with a cell phone, or even on your wrist with a watch. Those computers are just analogies for the brain, for the mind. They are tools that we use to kind of offload some of the cognitive functioning that we would normally do, but we can do it much faster and more efficiently with the computer. So a lot of times you'll see that these two kind of the revolution of one is really kind of talking about both computer science and cognition. And this gives rise to the development of artificial intelligence, which, if you've been keeping track of lately, is just reaching new and more heights. Like I think of the Dolly AI system that allows you, for example, to generate any kind of picture or image based on, whatever you put into the search bar, basically. Prior to this point, we were really talking about, thinking about psychology. The big emphasis was a behaviorist approach, looking at, okay, we have a stimulus, the learner encounters a stimulus and has a response to that stimulus. So they call it the S and R connection. And thinking about this now in terms of, computer information, kind of extending that, or maybe broadening the analogy. You have input from the environment, you have the computer or the human brain, whichever one you want to use, followed by output. So it's not a dynamic change in terms of what we expect, kind of updating that model, but I think we're using terminology that makes a little more sense. It's updated for a more updated understanding of how cognition works. So that's just kind of setting the table. Now we're going to get into some topics related to cognitive psychology. And the first one is thinking. Like anytime you see that word cognition, all we're really saying is thinking. You can kind of mentally substitute those concepts or words together. And speaking of concepts, human beings, we think in terms of concepts. Basically, what I'm saying is, our thinking is categorized. We group things that are similar based on characteristics. That's how we organize information in terms of our thinking. We organize, for example, all animals that have that have 4 legs and a tail, and their tongues wag and they slobber and they bark. We have the concept of that for dogs, for example. We categorize things that look like dogs into that same category, and concepts are really helpful in terms of our thinking. They allow us to generalize from one experience to the next. They allow us to create associations, basically allow us to learn. They aid us in memory. They make memory more efficient. Instead of having to memorize a million different categories or names for things, I can put those similar things in different concepts or categories. It makes it much more simple. It's like chunking that we talked about in chapter 6. They give us clues about how to react to a similar object or experience. So we are cognitive misers, and being able to think conceptually, grouping things categorically is extremely efficient for our thinking and saving energy, cognitive energy. Another way that we approach thinking is a prototype model. Typically, when we have concepts in mind, we have kind of an ideal example. And this is very subjective. Like, for example, I have a golden retriever as a dog. Her name is Pumpkin. And anytime I think of dogs, oftentimes I now think of golden retrievers. Like, they are my prototype of what a dog looks like. But, you know, maybe for someone else, like let's say you grow up with like a smaller dog, like a Chihuahua. You know, I had a professor in college and in grad school who had a Chihuahua, and like anytime she talked about dogs, she always talked about like either her Chihuahuas or just Chihuahuas in general. So maybe her prototype in this example would be a smaller dog, like a Chihuahua. But a prototype is kind of like our best example when we're thinking about a concept. And again, we look for things like resemblance. You know, and now this is fine in terms of like the overall world, like being able to organize our understanding categorically, but we will touch on later chapters where this kind of categorical thinking can be problematic. It can be misleading, especially if we're applying it to people. We're grouping people together on like characteristics. I hope you can kind of see where this is going. It could potentially lead to stereotyping, which, you know, there are positive stereotypes, negative stereotypes, but either way, you know, we're not making accurate, you know, decisions when we think about people kind of in those prototypical terms. A lot of what makes human cognition so advanced, and it's not, you know, we're not the only ones who could do this, but our ability to solve problems. Like that is ultimately how we define intelligence. That's how we think about, you know, cognition, is our ability to solve problems. And problems are all around us. I mean, a problem can be a literal math problem you have in your homework, or it could be just something like, well, I'm awake now. What am I going to do with my day? What am I going to wear? What am I going to eat? You know, I mean, we encounter all kinds of problems in various shapes and sizes. In our advanced cognition as humans, to solve those problems is kind of, you know, what puts us at the top of the food chain. So really, in order to solve problems, we have to frame the problem, understand it, like frame it. Is this a solvable problem? Is it not? We have to develop good problem solving strategies, and ultimately with wisdom, with practice, we develop better solving strategies. Some of those might be creating sub goals, like picking the big goal and you know, achieving smaller goals towards that bigger goal. Algorithms, these are like following a recipe or a formula. As long as you follow the specific steps, you should get the solution. Heuristics are shortcuts. Heuristics are, you know, maybe you have enough experience, you can kind of find a way to cut corners to save time. The only problem is you're a little more prone to error if you cut corners. You know, develop good strategies, evaluate the solutions. Ideally, many problems will have more than one solution, and that's where you have to kind of figure out, okay, is this a good solution or not? And then redefine the problems and solutions over time. Don't get stuck in looking at a problem one way. You know, be willing to step outside of your comfort zone or step outside of the box, so to speak. What are some ways in which we solve problems? What are some of the obstacles that get in the way of our ability to solve problems? One is fixation, like, hey, this has worked before, this strategy has worked before. You get fixated on it and you're unwilling to try new things. Specifically, functional fixedness, realizing, like looking at an object at its function, realizing or only seeing it as having one function. So for example, if you are tasked to solve this problem, you need to be able to hold both of these ropes in your hand without letting go, and you're only able to use, the objects in the room presented. Some people have a tough time solving this problem. They don't realize that, oh wait, I could actually hook this wrench, I could tie it to this one and kind of use it as a pendulum to swing back and I can grab it, then I can make it easier to grab onto, because they're only, if you can't tell, I believe that's a wrench. I'm not really good with tools, so if it's not a wrench, I apologize. But the point is, like, if you fixated only on this as a wrench and thought, okay, wrenches are, for undoing bolts or whatever, you may never see that the potential solution could be to use it with the string. So that's what I mean by functional fixedness, is when we get fixated on an object only having one particular function. That can be problematic. Here are some other examples of problems you might look at. The candle problem. So let's say you have the candle here, you have matches, and you have tacks. How could you mount a candle on a wall so that it wouldn't drip on a table or on the floor and still be burning? So maybe take a moment and think about it. Maybe pause the video. I'll reveal the solution in just a moment. If you're back, I'm assuming if you're here now, I'm assuming you paused it and thought about it, or whatever, and here's a solution. You could just tack the box to the wall and put the candle on top of that, and therefore there you go. Another problem, the 9-dot problem. These are all in your textbook, so honestly, for the sake of time, I'll stop here and you can take a look at it, but for the sake of time, I'm just going to kind of keep moving forward. The 6 matchstick problem, you can either Google these or you can look at them in your textbook. Another thing that really makes human cognition stand out is our ability to reason, is to draw conclusions based on the evidence or information that is available. This is a very much, I don't think it's uniquely human, but humans are extremely good about these kinds of things. We use inductive reasoning, which is more bottom up, going from a specific example to a general rule. And then we also are capable of using deductive reasoning, which is more driven by logic rather than data. It's more of a top-down approach. Maybe some of these terms remind you of chapter 3, in sensation and perception. The same thing is happening here in terms of how we organize our cognition. So a little bit of review there. Also, part of our cognition, our advanced cognition, is our ability to make decisions, to see, here's the problem, I have so many choices to solve it. How do I choose? And that could be simply like the example here, like you go to a store and you're trying to pick out new clothes. In a store, you have lots of options. So how do you make the choice of, which shirt to buy or which, outfit to choose or whatever? Ideally, you might want to maximize the outcome. Maybe that might mean finding the best deal in terms of going shopping, or maybe it might mean getting the best outfit, like coming away looking the best. You're not necessarily worried about the savings, but you just want to come away with a really good outfit or one that fits, something like that. We have, in terms of making decisions and kind of arriving at those decisions through reasoning, we have 2 systems. Kind of one is system 1. It's much more automatic. It's rapid. It's a heuristic. It's intuitive, kind of like that gut feeling. If like someone asks you a question, hey, would you rather go to restaurant A or restaurant B? And your first response is like, oh, I'd rather go to restaurant B. I hate restaurant A. You don't even have to think about it. It's like that immediate reaction. That's more of a system 1 approach versus system 2. It's much more controlled, deliberate, slower, effortful, analytical. This is where we can really slow down and maybe weigh our options. So, sometimes maybe some problems we approach it more automatically, but other problems we rely more on a controlled approach. Maybe deciding, hey, what college I want to go to, and sitting down and thinking about, okay, here's the benefits of this school, the benefits of this one, the drawbacks of the, so a much more deliberate approach. We are also human beings. Every human being is biased to some extent, and we see that bias show up in terms of the decisions we make. Some of the biases include loss aversion. We want to avoid losses as opposed to making gains. We also have confirmation bias, where we'll seek out information that we'll only look for the information that confirms our ideas. We're looking for confirmation or affirmation, however you want to say it. The hindsight bias, kind of reporting that, oh, I knew it all along, falsely reporting that you knew it all along. I see this a lot in sports, like, after Team X wins, and even if nobody said they thought they were going to win, the next day in the media, on social media, on ESPN, all these places will come out and say, oh, we should have known it all along. See, X, Y, and Z. Here's the reason why we knew it all along. And turns out they, didn't say that before. The availability heuristic is predicting the probability on ease of access. Like when you're making a decision, like using the most available information that comes to mind, the one that is easiest to recall. Base rate neglect, another bias, ignoring info about general principles, ignoring those general rules to a problem. Representativeness heuristic, is a fancy way of saying stereotypes. It's making judgments based on stereotypes, whether it's about people, places, or other things. Human beings, as part of our, part of our intelligence, our advanced cognition, is we are critical thinkers, or we can be critical thinkers when we so choose to, which means we can think reflectively, we can think deeply, productively, we can evaluate things, we can make decisions based upon those evaluations. There are certain skills we might associate with being a critical thinker. And one of those is being mindful as opposed to being mindless. Mindfulness is where we are actively alert in the present moment. And we are, we're not sort of bound by the past or the future, and we can truly reflect on what is here and now. Also being open-minded, that's really helpful in terms of critical thinking, which means you are open to looking at the world in new ways, new perspectives. Creativity, really, when it comes to thinking, we're talking about the difference between divergent and convergent thinking. Divergent thinking, is really, it's being able to think outside the box. Convergent thinking is thinking inside the box. And sometimes you need both. Like sometimes you literally need both. I don't think it would be fair to advocate that, people should only be creative thinkers. Like sometimes we need to kind of put our thinking into a box and frame it in a way to kind of, keep things more neat and tidy in terms of our thinking. But other times it's important to really let the mind go, really let, be creative, brainstorm, be flexible, be playful, be intrinsically motivated as opposed to intrinsically, be willing to face risk, especially, doubt, be willing to face doubt as well. Be objective in evaluation of your own thinking, of your own work. You're not trying to hide from it. So our second topic as we move into this chapter is intelligence. I think I addressed this earlier. When we think about intelligence, there are many definitions and ways of thinking about intelligence, but ultimately, it really depends on culture, time, and place. Some cultures, for example, might think about, I've heard of some African tribes, I don't know the specific name, but they measure intelligence because they have very large, extensive families. They measure intelligence in terms of your ability to remember all of your family members. Like the person who can remember all 300 of their relatives is considered very intelligent, versus in the United States, we think about it purely in terms of problem solving. We in fact define it in terms of the single, or the most dominant theory currently is Spearman's G, that intelligence is general intelligence, that we simply call G. Unfortunately, how we've measured intelligence and assessed intelligence over time has not been easy and has a specific past that is both, racist, xenophobic, just not good. Like, for the longest time, like intelligent theory was kind of used for the justification of things like eugenics, which, it's the understanding that certain groups are more superior based on, their intelligence, their genetics, whatever lens you're trying to use. So intelligence is a very fascinating topic, but it is one that has a very kind of troubled history. And ultimately, I think we just, intelligence, yes, it's a number. You can take a test, you get a number. But ultimately, what we're talking about is your ability to contribute to the world, your ability to solve problems, your ability to be useful to yourself and to others. It's not just like your score on a test. So how do we measure intelligence? When we're talking about and measuring really any psychometric, quantity or quality, whether it's intelligence, personality, whatever, it's really important that we have validity, meaning, is the measurement, the construct, are we actually measuring what we intend to measure? Like, can we make accurate inferences based on someone's intelligence, based on how they score here? We're concerned with reliability, meaning consistency in performance. If you take an intelligence test one day, and if you take it again, let's say a year, your intelligence should not like just widely vary across the board. Like you shouldn't go from like a 125 to like a 75 the next time, assuming everything is up, above board. Like you're not, obviously like tanking the test or something, the instrument should be able to capture reliably your intelligence pretty consistently across time. The procedures typically are standardized as well, meaning they are uniform, they are administered and scored the same across time, place, people, all of those things. Some of the more common intelligence tests or some of the earliest work start with the Stanford Binet, with this concept of your mental age divided by your actual age times 100. And that's kind of what gets us the idea of that initial intelligence quotient, IQ. You have the Wechsler, for adults and the Wechsler for children. Intelligence, we know, like many other characteristics, if we get enough people, if we collect enough data, this is how the data ends up being distributed. This sometimes is called a bell curve. Please don't call it a bell curve. It is a normal distribution. There was a book in the 90s called The Bell Curve, and it was a book written and using psychological data on intelligence tests and other variables to justify white supremacy. So this is not a bell curve. This is a normal distribution. But typically what this graph is suggesting is that if you measured enough people in terms of their intelligence, the vast majority would probably be here clustered towards the center. They would probably be somewhere between 84 and 116. The mean, the average score would be 100. So if you scored a 100 on an IQ test, that would mean you scored better than 50% of the people who took it, and you scored worse than 50% of the people who took it. If we go out to the further we go out in terms of the extremes to intelligence, IQ scores, we see the numbers decrease pretty significantly. Like we just don't have a lot of people in society who score 148 and above, for example. IQ tests, like any other test, are subject to bias, for example. So now we see a bigger push for what are considered culturally fair tests. One of the more common ones is the Raven's progressive matrices. The idea is to reduce bias. There are also genetic influences. We don't know. There's not a single gene for intelligence. In fact, there's probably, thousands or more that might be linked to genes. We do know to some extent that intelligence is heritable. I mean, there's a heritability score we can track and measure, seeing the relationship between nature and nurture and intelligence. Environmental influences have an impact on your intelligence, your consumption of certain foods, like having a diet that's higher in omega-3 fatty acids, the good fats that your brain needs to develop. That's a good sign. Good diet, exercise, stable home environment, good schools, avoidance of stress. Like those are all factors that would be very helpful in terms of intelligence. Exposure to preschool education, early ed, interactive parents who read to their children is associated with higher intelligence. So here's some example of the Raven's progressive matrices. You might be given something like this and said, for this item, the respondent must choose which of the numbered figures would come next in the order. So you would need to pick one out of here. It looks like it would be this one. I'm assuming it would just be the square, I guess, because the lines are already there for us. But anyways, yeah. So you would just pick, and the idea is these are just general objects. I've seen in past intelligence tests. I don't remember specifically the test. It might have been the Wechsler, it might have been the Binet, but there was a question like describe playing croquet. And so like if you've never played croquet before, how on earth could you answer that question? Like croquet is a sport we typically associated with people who are more affluent, more wealthy, more white usually. So that kind of question would be obviously biased against anybody who comes from a different cultural background. Whereas this is the kind of intelligence testing questions that is attempting to be culturally biased, free, excuse me. So number 6. Oh, is it number 6? Oh, I guess I got that wrong. Oh, that's embarrassing. Sorry, I really put almost no thought. I just kind of looked at it briefly. So you've probably been sitting there the whole time and looking at it and going, well, it's supposed to be number 6, and he clearly got it wrong. So anyways. All right. So the Flynn effect is also an interesting phenomenon related to intelligence. The Flynn effect just shows that basically IQ scores have gone up, progressively have gone up over time. If we compare the average if you gave an IQ test from 1932 to someone in 1997, the average score would be 120 as opposed to 100. We just know more. We know more than we did then. We have better access to technology, to food, all kinds of things. A lot has obviously changed in what looks to be 65 years. So that probably has a lot to do with it. It's not necessarily maybe that people are we're like superhumans and we're smarter. No, just a lot of things have changed since then. So we do see, for example, there are differences in between groups in terms of IQ scores, but we have to be very careful about kind of how we interpret. I don't know who that is. Sorry. We have to be careful. For example, we do see that Asian Americans score higher than Europeans, European Americans who tend to score higher, maybe in individuals who are coming from a African American background. Race is a social category. However, it's not an indicator of genetics. Like, it tells us maybe necessarily, it's again one of those categories, one of those concepts we can use to categorize individuals, to understand, kind of groups differently, but it's not the end all be all. Really, differences in IQ are much more likely to be due to differences in terms of access to wealth, resources, educational opportunities. And some groups, in the United States, for example, have more or have different access, have better access to education and other resources compared to others. So we shouldn't just look at that and go, oh, therefore being Asian or being white makes you smarter. That's not it. Just simply having those environmental matter. The environmental factors matter a lot. So yeah, the IQ differences between groups are shrinking as we see more and more. We're kind of pushing. We're getting to a point, or hopefully getting to a point, where more and more people, regardless of what group they belong to, are able to kind of maximize their potential. When we think about intelligence, we can also think of it in terms of extremes. Like, anything considered over 130 on an IQ test is considered gifted. Typically we see a lot of research that shows these people who are considered gifted are socially well-adjusted, pretty successful as adults. It's important to recognize that innate ability and support, but also, make sure that those individuals are getting the support they need and are given lots of time to practice. We have to be really careful too about the reflection, identifying children, especially early on, as being gifted. These are social perceptions, which might also be influenced by stereotypes. Like, for example, we might look for some students to be intelligent and maybe not others based on certain stereotypes that we have. So it's really important to be mindful and aware to avoid those kinds of biases. Anything below IQ of 70 is considered intellectual disability. Another way of thinking about it is low adaptive functioning in terms of being able to function, normally in society, being able to take care of yourself. So this definition is somewhat conceptual, social, and practical. We also have to be considered, is this a result of some kind of organic, for example, if the individual was born and diagnosed with Down syndrome, for example, that's much different than maybe someone who might come from a background where maybe there's just a lot of poverty, there's not a lot of access to education, things like that. It's much more cultural, familial versus genetic or organic. So there are several different theories about intelligence. There is Sternberg's triarchic theory, which says, hey, triarchic, a good way of thinking about that is there's 3 types of intelligence: analytical, which is more of that like book smart, being able to analyze, judge, evaluate, compare, contrast; creative intelligence, being able to think outside the box, some of that divergent thinking; and practical intelligence. It's that street smarts, being able to put ideas that you've learned maybe in school, but put them into actual practice, put them into real world practice. Gardner, on the other hand, taught about, I want to say that he's identified at least 11 or more different intelligences, but I want to say that there's at least 9 have been verified, at least on the research side of things. And those are verbal, spatial, interpersonal, naturalist, musical, mathematical, bodily, kinesthetic, intrapersonal, and existentialist. These are all the ways in which, according to Gardner, an individual can be intelligent. Someone who's really good at sports, for example, might score highly on bodily kinesthetic, whereas someone who's a math professor would score, obviously pretty high on mathematical. Okay, our last topic we're going to touch on briefly touch on before we go is the subject of language. Language, of any sort, we're talking about a specific form of spoken, written, or signed language based on a agreed upon system of symbols. So language has the ability of infinite generativity, meaning we can take, for example, in the English language, we only have 26 letters. There is a finite number of words in the English language, but there is an infinite possibility of how we can arrange those words. So the language is complex in that sense. The basic structures of language, we have the phonology, which are the basic phonemes or sounds that are used to make words. We have morphology, or the rules for how we put those words together, prefixes, suffixes, things like that. We also have syntax. Those are the rules for organizing sentences, or how we'll phrase things. Sorry, my little fitness watch is going off. Semantics, the overall meaning of words and sentences. The pragmatics, the use of language, knowing when it's appropriate to say something, when it's not appropriate to say something. So there's a lot built into language that maybe we don't even think about, but we use every single day. So there's an ongoing debate in psychology too about, the role of language in cognition. Like, for example, can you think without using language? There's a large debate about what role does language play in cognition. For example, Benjamin Worf talked about the, language being able to determine thought. And there's some evidence by looking at individuals who are bilingual. It's very advantageous at times to be bilingual, and that can also reflect in terms of intelligence testing and problem solving. And we do see, for example, also the role of cognition and language with individuals who have Williams syndrome or dyslexia, that can perhaps change the nature of how they think. So what influences happen on language, especially language development? There are certain biological influences, for example, regardless of the language, even if it's spoken or unspoken, like sign language, children, will go through certain universal patterns of development and usage of language. That language is more or less hardwired into us, for lack of a better term. And we also see language is specialized in the left hemisphere of the brain too. Environmental factors, from a behavioral standpoint, this is a learned skill. This is something we learn from others, observationally, through operant conditioning. For example, when a child says their first word and they say mama or dada, parents get really happy and excited. They reward the child. They praise their child. They're very excited. And according to behaviorists, this is perhaps, motivating to keep learning language. And there's also evidence that there is a critical period for language exposure. We know that if children are not exposed to language at a certain time, they can face deficits throughout their life in being able to communicate language. Socioeconomic status. Parents who come from higher socioeconomic backgrounds are more likely to read to their children, more likely to have books, more likely to use a larger vocabulary. So therefore, children get exposed to more words. Word exposure is a huge predictor of ability for, language usage later on in life. So some of the milestones we might see in language, for example, 0 to 6 months, they're cooing. 6 to 12 months, they might speak their first words. By a year and a half, they understand about 50 words. 18 to 24 months, they're using that caveman speech, like me hungry, I want. 2 years, it's growing. 3 to 4, they might start asking questions. They have a much more understanding of the pragmatics in language. So they're getting to the point where they can, enter school age year. By about 5 or 6, when they are in school, they now are dealing with a vocabulary of around 10,000 words. 6 to 8, more rapid development. 9 to 11, they can use synonyms, better conversational strategies. And these are reflections of higher cognitive development, which we'll talk about in subsequent chapters, especially our chapter on developmental psychology. So one last thing, kind of wrapping up, even though language has all these critical periods, we are negotiating and learning and navigating language throughout our lifetime. Like, there are sensitive periods that do vary across different language systems. Second language learners, the new vocabulary is easier to learn. That second language, it's easier to learn the new sounds and new grammar. For adults, learning a new language is not easy. It's possible, but it takes more effort. So, I'm a big proponent of continuing to learn, especially language throughout life. Get Duolingo, expose yourself. You only learn and grow more by understanding another language. So that's going to be it for chapter 7. I'll see you around for chapter 8, and we're past the halfway point at that point. So see you then. Take care. Peace.